Thank you, Morten. My name is Guri Nordtvedt, and I am so fortunate that I get to chair Janne Fauskanger. Janne is gysla flinke, which is stavangersk for really, really, really good. For those of you who don't speak Stavanger. Janne is professor in mathematics education at the University of Stavanger and professor too at the Norwegian Mathematics Center in Trondheim. And I think in English that might be adjunct professor. I first met Janne when we did our master degrees. And at that time, Janne was really interested in children and their play, and the mathematics competence they expressed in their play, their dialogues and communication. After moving into teacher education, Janne's interest has changed to teacher competence, teacher education, the quality of teacher education, the quality of mathematics education. And the past years, she had a big project in Malawi. But I don't think that will be part of this presentation. We're particularly pleased that Janne is presenting at the NORMA conference because she has invested a lot in the NORMA conferences the past years and been part of the International Program Committee for at least 2 conferences in 2017 and 2020. And in 2020 we did 2 runs because of the pandemic. So it's a lot of effort put into the organization. And we're also very happy to have you present to us today. So thank you, Janne, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you for inviting me to give this talk. And to all of you, welcome to this presentation. It's entitled, I know multiplication, but what do I do? And it's about teacher education and professional development by practicing core teaching practices. And during my session, I will ask you to talk to each other, just like in yesterday's session, and to bring you back, I have this signal. You will also need something to write on and with, so please have a pen and paper or a digital device available. I will come back to the first part of the title, but the last part relates to a shift witnessed in the field of teacher education, a shift towards making practice a central source for teacher learning. So, in response to critiques that teachers are not always well enough prepared for the challenges of the classroom, teacher educators worldwide, and also in the Nordic countries, have been redesigning programs to focus more on practices. And these practices is thus a central source for teacher learning. And such efforts have included both changing and lengthening field experiences. In Norway, for example, we have now 105 days of field experiences, but also bringing more opportunities to engage in practice into universities. And in the Nordic countries, teacher educators have been experimenting with how to reorganize their programs around a set of core practices or around things that teachers do that are central to the work of teaching mathematics. For example, eliciting students' strategies and for finding the number of dots in a quick image, as in this picture, and also representing the strategies on the board, as a teacher has done in this picture. This turn towards practice-based teacher education, when it comes to research, is better documented in the United States than in the Nordic countries. And here are just a few examples of such documentations. And with this recently published book as one exception, what has been less well documented are the global efforts to create more practice-based teacher education programs. In particular, programs for practicing teachers. So, my examples of documentation or research will be from the Norwegian context and from professional development for practicing teachers. So when I talk about professional development, it will be practicing teachers. But the work we have done is inspired by the Teaching Works project at the University of Michigan, which Deborah Ball is heavily involved in. The Teacher Education by Design project at the University of Washington, and also the work done to support excellence in teaching at Stanford University. The first part of the title, I know multiplication, but what do I do, is more personal. Because 15 years ago, I was supervising teachers their first year in school, and in one of these supervision meetings, a third grade teacher started to cry, saying, I know multiplication, but what do I do? As she was educated at the University of Stavanger, my university, and her grades were really high, I kind of realized that the way we prepare teachers did not always help them do the work of teaching mathematics. So following this, our research, as well as our teacher education and professional development, has slowly turned towards focusing more on teaching practices. And this is also supported by our curriculum, which states that teacher education should qualify teachers to do the challenging and complex work of teaching. Using capital letters for do is it's not in the document. So, before I continue, I would like to invite you into a situation from a classroom to do some work of teaching mathematics. The instructional activity was a string starting with the task 100 divided by 4. And the context of the string was a relay. The students were going to, the relay was 100 meters and 4 students were going to run equally long. And one of the students in this class said, they have to run 25 meters each because 4 times 25 equals 100. So, if you were teachers in this class, how would you represent this strategy on the board? Please write down your representation for they have to run 25 meters each because 4 times 25 equals 100. I'll give you 10 seconds to write it down. So, you started to talk, and you will continue with that, because now you can turn to the person sitting next to you and look at each other's representations and argue for the way you have represented this student strategy. I can hear that the sound is too loud. You couldn't hear the sound, so maybe those with the sound could raise the computer sound. The teacher in this classroom represents the student strategy by drawing a number line, dividing it into 2, and then dividing each of these parts into 2 equal parts again. And since the context here was professional development, the teachers discussed the difference between representing 100 divided by 2 and 4 times 25. And after a short discussion, the group agreed that this student strategy should be represented as 4 jumps of the length of 25, and in addition write 25 above each arch, as illustrated here. I'm not saying that this is better or worse, but this is what the teachers discussed. Some of you might have similar ideas. And this is an example of one core practice of mathematics teaching, representing student strategies on the board. And this situation is also an example that makes it important to discuss representing student strategies also for practicing teachers, because it's hard work representing at the spot when you're in the classroom. And I'll come back to this example. And with this as a background, I will just continue by a very short glimpse into the history of practice-based teacher education. And this will be followed by digging a bit deeper into the concept of core practices And I will illustrate core practices with some research results from practice-based professional development. And I will conclude by identifying some issues and challenges for future research and also for future professional development. So, what can be learned from the history of practice-based teacher education? Teaching used to be viewed as a relatively simple practice, and I think some still think it is. And according to Fauskanger, many Americans in the 19th century held the belief that teaching required little when it comes to special preparation and knowledge. Teaching became more academic in the first half of the 20th century, and this was also the starting point for focusing on teaching practices. And one example highlighted by Fauskanger is the Commonwealth study, which resulted in more than 1,000 practices important for teachers. So we need a long teacher education to learn all these. In more recent work, teaching is conceived as a combination of technique, analysis, interpretation, and judgment. So the teacher uses skills to elicit and interpret student thinking, like you did, and based on that interpretation decides what to do next. For example, how to represent student strategies on the board. And this is very different from work from what has been common throughout the history of teaching. The focus of student thinking is at the core, and researchers are aiming at identifying the practices most important for teaching. And 1,000 practices might be too many to focus on in teacher education. But when talking about practice-based teacher education, the concept of practice is important. So if you were asked what practice meant, what would you say? Talk to the person sitting next to you for a few seconds. What is practice? Okay, you might have different conceptions of practice. And in 2010, Magdalena Lampert attempted to provoke clarity by investigating 4 conceptions of practice. And you might have talked about one or all 4 of these. One conception of practice is that implementing an idea is different from having the idea. And I think that is the commonly made this distinction between theory and practice in most documents. A second conception is that practice is something that we do repeatedly in order to improve performance in it. And it's more used when playing a piano than when becoming a teacher, I think. Third, the practice of teaching includes people who have adopted the identity of a teacher. And a fourth meaning of practice relates to routines that are done constantly and habitually in the classroom. And an example of such a practice is representing student strategies on the board. And these practices done constantly and habitually are often described as core practices, and they're often understood as identifiable components fundamental to teaching. But as we saw in the 2-minute and 20-second clip yesterday, there are a lot of practices that might be fundamental to teaching. So, I will continue by diving a bit deeper into the concept of core practices and show you some research results. According to Grossman and her colleagues, core practices are based in research on teaching, learning, and interaction, and they aim at providing a common language to describe the work of teaching. Gorsman and colleagues say that core practices are central to the daily work of teaching. They are central to supporting student learning, and they are also fundamental for developing other and more complex practices. And the goal they highlight for a core practices approach to teacher education and professional development is development of adaptive expertise. They highlight these examples of core practices across subject areas: eliciting student thinking, providing instructional explanations, and facilitating classroom discourse. And for mathematics, launching a problem to provoke mathematical thinking and representing student strategies are examples of core practices. But in the literature, it's also highlighted that it's easier to talk about core practices than to do them. And here is an example from where students work on the problem written here at the top of the slide. So just individually read it and solve the problem. I'll give you a few seconds. Since you're researchers and mathematics educators, I think that will be enough time. So in the classroom, in a conversation between the teacher and students, a student starts by saying 6, but soon says she had to think a bit more, and after a few seconds thinking while looking at her fingers, she says, "That would be 7. The teacher replies, "Tell me how you got 7. And now you have to concentrate, because the student says, "Well, because I knew that 7 trees was 21, and then I took 2 from each, and that would make 6, and then there'd be 3 others, and then you'd put 1 from that 3 into each one, and the 2 would be 6, so plus 1 more would be 7. And then she smiles. So, your task is now to elicit this student's mathematical thinking. So take a minute to discuss with the person sitting next to you, what does she know mathematically? What knowledge do a teacher need in order to elicit this student's mathematical thinking? And what teaching practices do you think would be the next step? This is how Emson and Jacobs have described this student's mathematical understanding. When the student says, "I knew that 7 trees was 21, this seems to be a known fact. When the student says, and the associative property of addition is used when the student combined 2 from each, because they combined 2 trees. And the property of addition is used to combine, an addition to add them together and make 6 in the last line here. Decomposition and both the commutative and associative properties of addition are used when they say you'd put 1 from that 3 into each one, because the single 3 they decompose and then she puts the 1 in combination with the 6, and at the end, the students add 6 and 1 to get 7. And this shows that it's challenging to elicit students' thinking, even if the mathematics is elementary. And to use the words of Li Ping Ma, as a teacher, you need profound understanding of fundamental mathematics. You need to know all these concepts to understand it. And you also need to practice the challenging practice of eliciting students' understanding and how to respond. And I chose this example because it's really not easy to see it on the spot. You have to concentrate and read a lot. And this practicing can be done in practice-based teacher education, where instruction should be aimed at ambitious learning goals, that are grounded in an expectation that all students will develop high-level thinking, reasoning, and problem-solving skills. But there are a lot of challenges to efforts aiming at such ambitious goals. I don't know how it is in the countries, all the countries represented here, but in Norway, almost 18% of the teachers are not educated as teachers. And this number is sadly growing rapidly. So there is a need also for practice-based approaches to profession development for those working in schools, at least in Norway. We can talk more about how it is in different countries later on. And for that, we need practice-based pedagogies. And referring to Grossman and colleagues again, they argue that in order to learn core teaching practice, both seeing, breaking apart, and trying out is important. So they identify the framework that includes representations, decompositions, and approximations of practice. Representations focus on how practices are made visible, such as videos of teaching. We saw that also yesterday. Classroom transcripts. I will show you some transcripts later on. Lesson plans and student artifacts. Decomposition of practice refers to partitioning the complex work of teaching and the practices into identifiable parts for teachers to learn. And approximations of practice refer to creating safe environments for teachers to practice teaching. And approximations might include role plays, rehearsals, and co-teaching. And based on efforts such as these pedagogies, McDonald and colleagues develop learning cycles of enactment and investigation. And in our research, our teacher education, and also our profession development, we build on this work and we use these cycles. And I come back to describe the different parts of the cycle. So, moving on to examples from our own research. The examples will be grounded in the Mastering Ambitious Mathematics teaching project. I know that at least some Norwegians know about the project. It takes a core practices approach to supporting the development of practicing teachers. Practices, a lot of practices. It is situated at the Norwegian Center for Mathematics Education at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim, and it's led by the leader of the center, Kjersti Wege. And my colleagues, Reidar Mosvold and Raimund Bjuland, the last one is here somewhere, and me, we have collaborated closely with Kjersti and her colleagues when exploring the data material from this project. It involved 30 mathematics teachers from 10 Norwegian elementary schools. And they participated in a 2-year project that was organized around these cycles of enactment and investigation. So the cycles involve 6 settings, as in this figure. And a given instructional activity was used across all settings. So the string starting with the task 100 divided by 4, the one you worked on, is an example of such an instructional activity used across all settings. In the first part of the cycle, preparation, the teachers prepared by reading articles about the enactment of the cycle's instructional activity and by watching videos of the enactment of this activity. And some of the teachers also tried out the activity in their own class. So when preparing, representations of practice were visible. In addition to the videos, the articles often included student artifacts. A lot of examples of that. This preparation was followed by a collective analysis of what they had prepared. And in this discussion, decomposing practices were included. And this is also true for the next part, because after this discussion, they co-plan to teach the instructional activity. And in co-planning discussions, practices were often decomposed into distinct parts in order to decide how to teach. After co-planning, the teachers rehearsed, and in the rehearsal, 1 or 2 teachers acted as lead teacher, whereas the others played the role as students. So a rehearsal is kind of a role play, at least for the students. And that's an example of an approximation of practice, and this is also true for the classroom co-enactment, where the students, where the teachers co-enacted teaching this to students, and the students were 11 to 12 years old. So everything happened on the schools, and we had students available. So this was a whole day setting. And the day ended by a collective analysis of what they had done the whole day, and also a preparation for the next cycles. And we have been studying different settings in the cycle, trying to understand how the teacher's engagement in the different settings provides opportunities to learn both the principles and core practices of mathematics teaching. And among the principles, to repeat, we try to treat students as sense makers and provide them with equitable access to learning. So we work on these principles parallel to the practices. So during the 2 years of the MAM project, 12 sessions were videotaped. And even though this was some years ago, a few years ago, we still are analyzing the data material. And we also had focus group interviews at the start of the project and after 2 years with a group of teachers. And when analyzing the data, we have used several frameworks in order to understand what teachers might learn from participating. And I will now present a few examples of findings, starting with teachers' planning. Teachers' planning is found to be an important part of the work of teaching mathematics. But it is still a less studied phase, and I don't know how to pronounce that name, but Superfine. Is that okay? Yeah. She says that planning is an underappreciated phase of the teaching. So I will start by showing an example from our co-planning. And we have explored co-planning with different perspectives, such as what teachers plan to notice, their anticipating practices, and the questions they plan to ask, including the purposes for asking particular questions. And I will show you some findings from my colleagues' explorations of questioning practices. So, when my colleagues explored co-planning sessions, they see that it's really complex to decide which questions to ask and how to ask the questions. So the teachers considered multiple rationales during these 12 co-planning sessions. So my colleagues found that they frequently discussed questioning with an emphasis of orienting students towards the learning goals, and this was often done parallel to stimulating classroom discussions. But they also, but the rationales also involved eliciting the details of student thinking, engaging students in explanations and arguments, providing students with opportunities to make connections and to generalize, and encouraging students to apply their strategies. And at the end, helping students to solve the problems without lowering the cognitive demand of the activity. This is something they discussed a lot, that no, if you ask that question, there is not a problem anymore, we have to. So that was discussed a lot. These considerations on the underlying rationales for questions and questioning practices, they were often entangled in discussions about what type of question to ask and also the order and timing of questions. Because I discussed a lot, when should we ask this question? How long should the students be discussing before we ask questions? So, showing a concrete example, almost a fifth of the segments addressing questions and questioning practices address the purpose of eliciting students' thinking. And I will illustrate this with an example from a quick image activity. In this activity, the students are shown this quick image for a few seconds, and then they are asked to how they organized and subitized to find the total number of dots. And earlier in this co-planning session, the teachers had agreed that the distributive property of multiplication should be the aim for this lesson. And this example extract comes after the teacher educator represented an expected student strategy, 3 times 9, as you can see at the bottom of this picture. And the teacher educator asked what they might be interested in knowing if students use this strategy 3 times 9, as you can see in the first line. What's interesting for us to know when they see the entire 9 group? And teacher 1 suggested questions to ask to uncover the details of students' thinking, to show that 9 equals 5 plus 4, and that 3 times 9 equals 3 times 5 plus 4, when the teacher says, that's 5 plus 4, 3 times 5 plus 4. And then a suggested question the teacher needs to ask. So this is just a little glimpse into how participants identified questions the teacher could ask to elicit the details of student thinking. And we also see how the purpose of eliciting students' thinking is closely related to the purpose of aiming towards the learning goal for the lesson, which in this case is the distributive property of multiplication. So this was co-planning. Moving on to rehearsals and classroom co-enactments. In this part of the learning cycle, the teachers could pause instruction by asking for a timeout, teacher timeout, or TTO. Here they were discussing how the lead teacher might choose to respond to a student contribution, and they decided how to steer instruction. And I know there is a lot of discussion about using teacher timeout in classroom co-enactments, because it kind of interrupts the teaching. But there are some studies of timeouts and rehearsals and co-enactments showing that in rehearsals, when teacher educators have investigated how pre-service teachers work in rehearsals, the findings indicate that they learn core practices parallel to adaptive teaching, and they also develop their mathematical knowledge for teaching. But not mathematics on a higher level, but mathematics on a deep level, as the example of the tables, all the things that were involved when the students answered 7, I argued for 7 in the examples as I showed you. There are some studies of practicing teachers' rehearsals, And one important finding is by reducing what teachers approximate, teacher educators could better support teachers' learning of adaptive instructions. So on rehearsals, there are some studies that we could build on in our work. And at our university, sometimes we stop with the rehearsal because it's easier to rehearse. You don't need to go to a school or to have kids come by bus to the university, as we do sometimes. There are also a few studies on teacher timeouts in co-enactments. But findings from a study from Gibbons show that timeouts in co-enactment afforded opportunities for the participants to make changes as the teaching went on, and they also managed to change the focus of the interaction from evaluation to collective considerations in the midst of teaching. And at our university now, we use a lot of timeouts when pre-service teachers are in practicum, because they feel very, it's better for them when they can take a timeout and ask, and not having to wait for 35 minutes until after the lesson. So there are some advantages, but also some challenges, of course, for using timeouts in co-enactments. So although the body of research on rehearsals and co-enactments in the context of professional development is growing, there is more to learn about these timeouts. And this is what we have been doing lately. We have analyzed all the timeouts, and we have explored how the teachers' collective engagement and reflections in the moment of teaching is illustrated. So as you can see here, in the rehearsals, timeouts focus mostly on using representation, aiming towards goal, launching problems, organizing the board, and facilitating student talk. And I know in Japan, board organizing is a subject in teacher education, and I can see that when trying to show students to kind of make similarities and differences between student thinking, board work was something they discussed a lot in the timeouts, but only in rehearsals. In the co-enactment, the participants also discussed which questions to ask to elicit the details of student thinking and how to respond, and also using representations and aiming toward goals. And I'll exemplify with aiming towards goal, and several timeouts focused on this. In this example, the goal they aimed at was the distributive property of multiplication, as I just said. And just prior to the timeout I'm going to show you, the teacher represented different student strategies on the board, both by writing numerical expressions and by illustrating in the quick image. And you can note that 3 times 4 plus 3 times 5 and 3 times 9 is already written on the board. And just prior to this timeout, the lead teacher represented 3 times 10 minus 1, as you can see in the red box at the bottom here. And the teacher educator asked for a timeout and said, no, the idea of using parentheses is interesting. Which is this, of course. We can see that a parenthesis might be needed here. But the teacher says that the strategy 3 times 9 is something to point to, because this can be used to show that 3 times 5 plus 4 equals 3 times 3 times 5 plus 3 times 4, he says. And he also illustrated follow-up questions to ask when he says, I was thinking that this with 3 times 9 is an excellent opportunity to get them to see 3 times 5 plus 4. You can ask them, does anyone see 9 in another way? Then we have 5 and 4, and you can write 3 times 5 plus 4. And this again led to a longer discussion about the distributive property of multiplication. And I think that, and later in the discussion, there was a long discussion about this. And one teacher said that it might be difficult for the students to see the 4 and the 5 in the quick image representing 3 times 9. And the lead teacher said that it might be interesting to show this on the quick image. How would you draw it, he says. And they ended up working quite hard on seeing that 3 times 9, the connection between 3 times 9, 3 times 5 plus 3 times 4, and 3 times 5 plus 4, not in the expressions, but in the quick images. So which strategies on the board do you think would be best for aiming towards the goal for this lesson? It is the distributive property of multiplication. Discuss with the person sitting next to you. If you were a teacher, which ones of these would you kind of highlight in order to help the students learn the distributive property of multiplication? Talk to the person sitting next to you. So, even though the teachers know the distributive property of multiplication, the teaching of the distributive property of multiplication using quick images is really hard, and there's a lot of discussion about moves, questions, what to do, what to ask. And we can see that the importance of using quick images to support students' understanding and help them see the connection between different expressions is something they can learn by discussing in a rehearsal. And this was also addressed in the following co-enactment. And here we join the co-enactment as a student has just explained these 2 expressions written on the board. But the lead teacher is uncertain about how to respond. So he asked for help in responding to this student's explanation. And the teacher educator suggested that the lead teacher should focus on why the 2 expressions have the same answer. So how do I know it'll be the same answer? And one teacher suggested you might use the images, as you can see in the second line. And this is something they had discussed in the rehearsal. And the teacher educator followed up this by turning to the students in the class, saying, can the images be used to explain why we get the same answer in these 2 expressions? And this also shows how the timeouts in the rehearsals and the co-enactments worked in complementary ways to provide opportunities for teachers to learn the practice of aiming towards goals. And later on, when in the discussion, this question led to that different students kind of explained so the teacher better could understand what the first students were saying. Another practice, use of representations, also representing students' mathematical ideas in writing and making connection between different students' talk and representations and between different kinds of representations was addressed in many timeouts. And in the rehearsals, recording students' thinking as accurately, mathematically accurately as possible was discussed a lot. As the example, is it the same to write 100 divided by 2 and 4 times 25? That's an interesting discussion, actually. And this example of a timeout I'm going to show you now is from a rehearsal of a string, starting with a task 100 divided by 4. That's the one you've already worked on yourself. So since we have worked on it, you can just give you some seconds to read through what this short teacher timeout was all about. And you know, I don't say what's correct or incorrect, but you know that they agreed on the picture at the top of this slide. In the co-enactment that followed, there was a similar situation, and the teacher educator again reminded the teacher to represent the student's thinking as accurately as possible. And just prior to the timeout here, one of the students says, I took the first half of 100, and then I took half of 50. And when I'll show you the timeout here in the co-enactment, the lead teacher represents this student strategy by representing 4 jumps on the number line. But the teacher educator asks for a timeout and says, can you draw it like the students actually said it? Meaning 100 divided by 4 as 100 divided by 2 divided by 2 instead of 4 times 25. And since they had discussed this in the rehearsal, the teacher understood what the teacher educator meant, that this was the opposite situation from what they discussed in the rehearsal. And she continued instruction by dividing a number line into 2, and then she divided each of these 2 parts into halves again. And they agreed that this student strategy could not be represented as on this picture. So representing and connecting student strategies in the moment of teaching is something that's really challenging. And I find that challenging too when my pre-service teachers or teachers are saying something. It might not always be as complex as the one you saw arguing for why she got 7, but still. And this was just a little glimpse into our research. And a mind-finding all over is that in order to learn core practices, the whole cycle is needed, because different settings make it possible for teachers to practice different core practices. As example, co-planning is needed to learn questioning practices, co-enactments to learn to, rehearsals to learn to aim towards goal, because here they really have deep discussion about that. And co-enactments are needed to elicit and respond to students' thinking, because that's difficult to practice if you don't have students. Our analysis of rehearsals in co-enactments also show that there were some differences in how the teachers share decision-making in the 2 settings. Rich collective discussions in the rehearsals and more specific suggestions in the co-enactments. And these specific suggestions often referred back to what they had co-planned or decided in the rehearsal. But the results also show that core practices of teaching are more than what teachers do. They involve a lot of thinking, decision-making, and sense-making. So practice-based teacher education is more than introducing new actions. That's actually a critique of practice-based teacher education. There's a lot of actions. It involves supporting teachers' sense-making about the dilemmas and demands they are facing in their work. And zooming out, I look across what the work happening in different national contexts, and not in the MAM project only, reveals a number of questions that scholars are currently grappling with in this area. In all contexts, the need to focus on practices parallel to content is highlighted. And as teacher educators, we need to help teachers know what to do. And I'll use this book when I end by providing some issues and challenges for future research. They highlight that more emphasis needs to be given on how practice-based pedagogies can support communities of practice in different countries, such as in the Nordic countries. Second, future studies ought to test the applicability and transferability of these ideas into more countries and different educational systems. And also, most studies are small scale, so we need larger scale attempts. Most studies are on pre-service teachers. We need more studies on supporting the learning of practicing teachers, and the MAM project is one such attempt. And we also need agreed upon methodologies to study practice-based teacher education. So future works in our field must include definitional work for what counts as core practices, and 1,000 practices might be too many, even though we have a 5-year study in Norway, 5-year master study to be a teacher. And not all of them might be equally important. And we also need to discuss how to best teach core practices, and then how to sequence representations, decompositions, and approximations, and provide opportunities to try out these practices in our university classrooms. And in Stavanger, we have decided that this learning cycle helps us with this. And I can see that there are only 2 minutes left, so when you see my slides, there will also be something about MAM as profession development, because we have developed profession development programs, which where you can see that there are 11 modules, and one of these modules are on representation. And this is in Norwegian. This is for preparation, forberedelse. And here you can see that there is a video, there is an article, and the teacher are asked to identify representation the teacher uses and for what purposes they are used. So we also, as a research community, we need to help teacher educators provide practice-based teacher education. Because teacher educators are not necessarily educated to focus on practices. I don't know about all of you. At least my education was not focused on the one we had together. We read about practices, but we didn't do very many practices. So in Norway, we had developed a course for mathematics teacher educators, focusing on the core practices of teacher education, as well as the core practices of teaching. And similar resources are developed at the University of Michigan, and Deborah can tell you more about this, and you have also online resources available for teacher educators. Lastly, we have to convince our politicians not to look for quick fix solutions. I don't know if that's a problem, but that's really a problem in Norway. They want quick fix within the 4 years they are elected for. We need to convince them to support long-term school-based professional development for practicing teachers, focusing on the principles and core practices of ambitious mathematics teaching. And with this recommendation, I end my presentation. Thank you for your attention, and welcome to this lovely campus of University of Stavanger, where we also use learning cycles together with our pre-service teachers. And the pictures on the slides are either from the MAM project or AI have made them for me.
So I want. I don't have sound. So I want to thank Janne for a really nice presentation, thoughtful, well-structured, thought-provoking. And we can all meet Janne later on today in the Meet the Presenters session. I have forgotten when, but it's in the program.
3 o'clock?
And yeah, and you all remember the word I used when we started to describe Janne? This is the Norwegian lesson. She's gysla flinke. So thank you, Janne. And a small token.
Oh.
And thank you. And I want to hug.